We're going to talk about the relationship between language and its use and how that can promote uh, um, a particular political position with regard to food. Um, I'm going to start with a quote from a particular book, um, a very strong polemic in favor of vegetarianism. This is Jonathan Ford's 2009 Eating Animals. And in this particular book, I was struck by this particular sentence. On average, Americans eat the equivalent of 21,000 animals in a lifetime. Well, as far as my math goes, that works out to be roughly about 300 animals a year, about an animal a day. And I tried to get my head around that and think about the times that I had eaten a whole chicken, for example, and it just didn't seem to make sense to me. Where could this figure have come from? Well, of course, it wasn't a figure that statistic that Jonathan Farr had worked on. He actually took it from a website run by a guy called No More, who calculated the statistic based upon USDA, United States Department of Agriculture statistics. But still, it's a phenomenal statistic to think of eating all those animals in a lifetime. So I went to the actual website, and then it became clearer. Okay, um, so as you can see, the breakdown is plenty of chickens. Yeah, a lot of chickens, and of course turkeys, and we probably, although he eats quite a lot of turkey, and then pigs and cows and rabbits if you like rabbit. But then the story begins to get a little clearer because then we get to fish, still possibly whole animals, but then we get to shellfish and we have this enormous figure of 17,000. So out of this 21,000, 17,000 are shellfish. Um, you have spaghetti and clams, and all those clams are counted as animals. Now, this, to my mind, is disingenuous because uh, it's a deliberate way of confusing the reader. We talked in a previous lecture about semantics, the semantic idea of prototypes. We have a particular prototype. So if I say the word animal to you, the prototype that should pop into your head, especially with food that we eat, is not clams, but something more like chicken. So this is a deliberate and misleading manipulation of language to further a particular position, an argument, and in this sense, it's a political position of vegetarianism. Note also, of course, in 2011, when I went back to this website, that number of 21,000 had actually reduced to 16,000. So that was a 5,000 reduction in the space of just 2 years. So that begins also to, 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 to suggest that there's certain doubts with this particular statistic. One other thing that struck me when I was looking at this website was the use of this particular phrase. In 2011, the average American meat eater was responsible for the deaths of 16,000 animals. Responsible for the death of. Every context in which that particular phrase occurs is negative, and I've given you a few examples there. The communist leaders of the USSR were responsible for no fewer than 13 million deaths, or Bin Laden, Bin Laden relative could be held responsible for the deaths of thousands, or even Abu Mazen responsible for the deaths of thousands of Syrians. So every time it occurs, it has a negative meaning. What we call this in linguistics negative semantic prosody. So every time you use the phrase, it has a negative connotation. So this particular phrase has been deliberately used to promote a particular argument. I played around with the particular use of that language and came up with something like this. A blue whale is responsible for the deaths of 14.6 billion animals in 1 year. Yeah, it sounds absurd when we put it in this context, because now we can see that it's definitely a manipulation of language. How can we think of a whale as being responsible for the deaths of? So this is just examples of how language can be used to promote certain particular political viewpoints. Um, So what I want to do for the rest of this lecture is talk mainly about a work by Guy Cook. Cook looked at the use of language in the debate over genetically modified organisms. And as you can see there, there's a picture of the first genetically modified animal sold as a pet. These are glowfish. They glow in the dark. So Cook's particular book is called Genetically Modified Language, The Discourse of Arguments for GM Crops and Food. Cook starts off by making an analogy that language functions rather like a window pane. Just as a window pane can be warped or smudged, so that when we look through it, we see that smudging or warping. So the same thing can happen with language, resulting in a distortion of how things are seen through it. Okay? Americans are responsible for the deaths of 16,000 animals in a lifetime. So that's the way that Cook looks at how language is used to distort and therefore promote a particular political viewpoint. You can have a look at the use of language from a political perspective in a speech by George Bush, which he gave in May of 2001 at Biotechnology Week. The speech is actually called the Proclamation, and these are what presidents do at these particular types of conferences. So the speech and a little handout is in the folder. So you can pause now and you can do the little look at the speech and look at it from the perspective of the use of we or our. And what does it mean? So in linguistics, we can distinguish between two particular meanings of we, what we call an exclusive we and what we call an inclusive we. So if a student asks a teacher, when do we have to do the assignment? The we there is exclusive because the teacher doesn't have to do the assignment, just the students. So that's an exclusive use of we. If the same student says to another student, we have to do the assignment by Friday next week, then that's an inclusive we because the student and the student who's been spoken to are part of the we. So if you look at this particular speech by George Bush, what you'll find out is it starts with 4 or 5 examples of the use of inclusive we, because he's talking about the planet, he's talking about the environment, he's talking about man. And of course, we talk about man, we're talking about everybody on the planet. But very quickly, he moves to a exclusive we, when the we is really referring not to everybody on the earth, but specifically Americans. So it's a device for bringing people into the argument by appeals to our general ideas of humanity, and then moving that to specifically talk about Americans and the environment. Cook looks at words and choice of words like nature and biodiversity. So choosing something like biodiversity moves us away from all the emotional connotations that are connected with nature. So if we said that genetically modified organisms are reducing our biodiversity, then it's kind of a smokescreen because what does that mean? What is biodiversity? Well, it's hard to connect it with nature, but if we use words like fiddling around with nature, of course, we understand that quite clearly. Interfering, meddling, playing, tampering, tinkering. This is all negative semantic prosody. The connotation is negative. And if we can see this also, if we look at the antonym of natural, unnatural, which of course is very sinister, we often personify nature. We often use an uppercase N with nature. We talk about Mother Nature. So, in terms of a political decision, if you're going to talk about genetically modified organisms, it's better to choose biodiversity because it's a very opaque term. It has no emotional baggage like the word nature. It's interesting if you go to a particular this particular website, Earth Values. This is a particular campaign to try and change the spelling of nature back to its use with an uppercase N. I'm going to read this because it's an interesting position they're putting forward, but it also illustrates from a linguistic perspective the way that language and how we use language can be used to promote particular ideas, political ideas. So the word nature was first used in the 12th century. It's come to represent, in its many definitions, all of the universe and the living and non-living things within it. Before the scientific revolution, and notice the uppercase there with scientific revolution, nature was considered in a spiritual context, deserving of respect and admiration. We still have the uppercase spelling of God, of course. Just as we've come to use nature's capital, animals, fresh water, minerals, forests, in a non-sustainable way, we've replaced the capital letter N in nature with a lowercase one. A coincidence? Perhaps. It's a very nice example of a movement that is trying to change language and our language conventions to promote a political perspective. Cook also looks at words and phrases and how they can be obscured. For example, science and technology. Are they the same or are they different? Well, technology is the application of scientific understanding for common good, commercial gain, or for military power. So modification and engineering are terms which are both technological. And what he found was often the word GM science and GM technology were used interchangeably. Now, the science really should be called plant genetics and the technology genetic modification. And once you begin to sort of separate them out like this, you can see that you can be for genetic science but against genetic modification. In the same way that you can be for the nuclear science, the science of atoms and particles, but you can be against the technology, the application of that knowledge to the building of nuclear weapons. So if you want to obscure the particular argument, then you can overlay words which should really be kept separate. Another phrase that Cook looks at is the phrase sound science, okay, or proper science, okay. So why does the word science have to be qualified by sound? If it's not sound, it's not science. Science could be described as unsound if it was full of mistakes, biased, or it was unacceptable based on ethical, political, or aesthetic grounds. The phrase sound science is therefore something that's used by one particular group to put down another group once their particular arguments, because if they can say it's based on unsound science, then they can defeat that particular argument. But notice, if it's unsound, it's not science. So again, it's a catchphrase that can be used to stop people actually listening to other arguments by dismissing it as not being science, or in the phrase, unsound science. Another word that's often used politically in these particular debates is the notion of improved. Okay, you can go back to the speech by George Bush and count the number of times he uses improve, and improvement is quite a lot. Improved presupposes that changes in food technology are beneficial, when this, of course, is up to a matter of debate. Um, a distinction is made by linguists between hooray words and boo words. So something like improved is definitely a hooray word. It makes you feel good. A word like recession, of course, is a boo word. We don't want to use those words. We only want to use hooray words. So that would explain why on your can of food or your packet of food you often see flavor enhanced. Well, that sounds great. Everybody wants more flavor. But notice the sinister connotations of flavor enhanced. What it tends to be used for is to conceal that particular ingredients, maybe more natural ingredients, have been substituted by additives and other things. Another phrase that originated at the beginning of this debate in Europe was the phrase Frankenstein Foods. This is an interesting example of how particular words and phrases used by one side can be recouped by another side, an opposing view, and used against the original people who brought out that word. So this was first used in the Daily Mail, a British popular newspaper, in 1999, and it was first used by anti-GM people, and it's now used more often by the pro-GM lobby. So what it has become is a kind of a convenient label to refer to irrational, uninformed, media-led resistance to genetically modified organisms. Here are some examples how it's been used by the pro-GM lobby. And it's been used to make the anti-GM lobby sound as though they are totally irrational. So, lurid warnings about Frankenstein foods have bedeviled the discussion. All this talk of Frankenstein food is misleading. A debate more known for hysterical panic over Frankenstein foods. So it's been used against the original people who invented that particular phrase. Finally, let's look at the word Luddite. And you can see this in a quote by the US Trade Representative Robert Zoellick, speaking about the European Union's opposition to GM. And what he said was, I think the European view on this is Luddite. And of course, Luddite has come to mean anyone who's irrationally opposes any forms of change or any forms of new technology. The word itself, and of course, as you can see, it's a boo word, originally meant not opposition to technology. It originally meant a particular group of workers, of weavers, who were organizing to improve their particular wages. And one of their tactics was to destroy some of the machinery, some of the weaving machinery, the new weaving machine that was coming in. Not because they were opposed to new technology, no. They probably embraced it. But what they were for was higher wages. So Luddite is a definite boo word. Once you use it, you class your opponent as being from the Dark Ages, totally opposed to any new technology. And again, another example of how a particular word has changed meaning to become such a boo word. So what have we done here? What we've done is try to look at the way that we choose language to promote a particular viewpoint, and that becomes the political use of language to promote particular positions. And we've looked at positions in terms of food and in terms of the debate on genetically modified organisms.